In the wet light of a Brooklyn dawn, when the East River breathes like a sleeping creature, the house stands quiet, too quiet for a city that survives on the scrape of oars and the clatter of dray wheels. Its eaves hold a thin ribbon of soot as if a thought once burned there and never quite went out. Neighbors call it a school, then a refuge, then something else when their voices drop. The O'Rourkes keep the shutters trimmed and the door brushed with lampblack. A brass bell hangs from a leather thong inside, and when it chimes, time itself seems to fix its collar and sit up straight. Children emerge at dawn in pairs, their palms together, their steps matched like the ticking of a metronome no one can see. They carry slates with loops and lines that echo the river's current, and tally marks that climb like prison ivy toward the margins. On the sill, a jar of white chalk; in the cellar, a coil of braided cord; in the kitchen, a ledger whose dates begin in 1832 and end abruptly in a year that won't admit itself aloud. The neighbors swear they heard prayers and recitations, but what they remember most is the metered silence afterward, that quivering blank between word and punishment, breath and release. You can pass the house in daylight and find little to quarrel with. A modest stoop, a star-shaped washer on the brickwork to keep the walls from bowing, a small cross that catches the sun. But at night the shutters seem to breathe. At night the bell swings without wind. A boy once pressed his face to the glass and saw himself multiplied, a dozen hymns, all wearing obedience like a borrowed coat. The girl from the Navy Yard swore she counted 7 shadows on the parlor wall when only 5 bodies stood there. And in her telling, the shadows looked patient. They looked like teachers. They called it a place of correction, then of charity, then of discretion, as if renaming could absolve what routine cannot. But the ledger had a way of insisting, where the city kept accounts of brick, timber, and bread, the O'Rourke kept accounts of posture, gaze, and breath. How long a child held a stare, how many times a name was swallowed. Brooklyn builds quickly, so do stories. This one builds like a bruise, slow, deep, and oddly tender at the edges. The summer that carried the O'Rourkes into Brooklyn arrived sick and trembling. Blue rags fluttered on doorways, marking houses already claimed by cholera. Bowls of vinegar sat on windowsills like quiet, futile sentries. The air itself seemed rinsed in fear. Every cough was a verdict, every handshake a small betrayal. They stepped off the ferry in silence. Patrick O'Rourke, tall, angular, with a face cut from the discipline of another century, carried a single trunk with both hands, as if it were more than weight. His wife, Maeve, walked half a pace behind. Older than her 35 years, she wore her black hair wound tightly like rope storing its own tension. They rented a modest brick house, not far from the Navy Yard. Ship timbers lay in rows there, hulks of oak like sleeping giants waiting for hands to wake them. The Irish Quarter was an uneven chorus of hammer strikes, dock shouts, and murmured Ave Marias. In this noise the O'Rourkes somehow carried a pocket of stillness. No sign hung on their door. Only a single sheet of paper tacked just inside the narrow hallway where the gaslight turned it honey-colored. The rule of quiet correction, 17 precepts, each brief enough to be learned in a single breath. Stand. Listen. Align. Speak only when prepared to be understood. Leave as you entered. Maeve's handwriting was precise, almost ecclesiastical, the kind that makes even small words seem older. By the second week, the neighborhood noticed the pattern. Children entered the O'Rourke house with hair combed flat and damp, faces scrubbed to a brightness that seemed unnatural against the grime of the docks. They left in pairs, hands still at their sides, their steps in perfect echo. One dock worker whispered, "They leave like they're carrying something invisible." Letters home from those children became rare. The postman, after a month of lifting his cap at the door and receiving nothing, learned to simply keep walking. Inside, life moved in low tones. The first-floor hall smelled faintly of soap and iron. Floorboards gave a soft complaint underfoot, not loud enough to disturb, but enough to remind you that the house was listening. Through the crack of a half-shut door, one could see a row of wooden chairs against the wall, each angled precisely the same way, as if awaiting an inspection from an unseen hand. One rain-heavy afternoon, Mrs. Finnegan from across the street stood watching the house through her lace curtains. She swore she saw Patrick pause at the window, watching the children as they copied figures onto slate boards. His expression was not pride nor cruelty, but something caught between. When asked later what she'd really seen, she only said, it was like he was measuring them, but not in inches. The city's chaos, horses clattering over cobblestone, fishmongers calling prices over gulls, seemed to fade on this single stoop. Time there was not a river but a trained animal, made to heel, to wait, to move only when given a command. At the nearby tavern, theories took root. Mercy, in a hard decade, one man said, sipping bitter beer. A house where the unruly learn to keep themselves. Another man leaned in, voice dropping. Or maybe not mercy at all, maybe not mercy at all, maybe they've found a way to polish the soul so clean it forgets the dirt it came from. If you pressed the floorboards just inside the O'Rourke parlor, a faint vibration traveled upward into your teeth, your jaw. No one could explain it. Patrick said it was the settling of the foundation. Maeve, when asked, said nothing. But in the silences after those explanations, some felt an unshakable truth. Whatever happened in that house, it was done with the same hand. Care and control, braided until you could no longer tell them apart. The winter of 1835 had been long enough to make the wood swell in its joints, doors stuck in their frames like stubborn thoughts. The O'Rourke house was no exception. The carpenter arrived just after dawn, his boots leaving dark crescents on the frost-dusted stoop. Inside, the air was warmer, but still the kind of stillness that feels curated. Maeve led him to the narrow stairwell, her voice low as though the walls might overhear. The door in question was wedged tight. He set down his tools, ran his palm along the grain, and felt the resistance. When his chisel bit into the seam, it struck something softer than oak. Sailcloth, folded and pressed deep into the cavity beneath the lowest step. He pulled it free. The cloth was stained with grease, edges worn to a suede softness from years of handling. Inside, a ledger. The paper was thick, the ink browned with age, the handwriting neat, deliberate, had a rhythm to it, as if the writer's hand moved to a metronome only they could hear. Tuesday, 2 degrees of voice lowered. Wednesday, 9 minutes of gaze sustained. Thursday, 12 deviations corrected. No full names, just initials. Sometimes not even that, only an X or a cross braided into a circle. The entries were modular, almost musical. Each line felt less like a record of events and more like a score for an unseen performance. The carpenter turned a page. The pattern continued. Days reduced to measurements of posture, tone, and silence. He didn't understand it, but he felt it, the way you feel the tides pull without seeing the water. Strange book, he murmured. What kind of school keeps time in obedience? He told 3 people before the day was out. By nightfall, the ledger had reached the tavern, where it was passed from mouth to mouth, each retelling, adding a new shade. Punishments, rituals, secret codes. In a city that thrived on rumor, the book was already halfway to sainthood. The next morning, Patrick O'Rourke came to the carpenter's shop. He didn't knock, he simply stepped inside, the cold following him like a shadow. "He'll have something of mine," he said. "A book." The carpenter replied, "Though I'm not sure what it is. It's not for you to be sure of." Patrick's voice carried the fatigue of a man removing a splinter from a sleeping child. Slow, careful, already resigned to the sting. The carpenter handed it over. Patrick wrapped it again in the sailcloth, tucking the knot tight as if sealing a wound. The ledger vanished after that. No one saw it again. Weeks later, the carpenter recanted his story. Then, in a moment of ill-loosened honesty, he recanted the recantation. "People aren't honest about the way they crave order," he told a dockhand. "We pretend to fear it while bargaining to be chosen by it." The dockhand nodded, though whether in agreement or dismissal, no one could tell. The door was planed smooth, swinging now with a new obedience. But those who crossed its threshold swore the air inside had changed, tighter, as if the house had inhaled and decided not to exhale. Mrs. Finnegan claimed she heard a sigh from the stairwell one evening, long after the carpenter had gone. Not the sigh of a person, but of the house itself, a slow release, like a lung clearing after years of holding something in. And in the weeks that followed, the children's steps seemed quieter, their eyes steadier, as though some invisible measure had been restored, and they were once again moving in time to it. The first voices did not agree. They came in like a choir rehearsing in an empty nave, notes wobbling, echoes arguing with the ceiling, each singer certain of their pitch, none quite in tune. Candlelight throws the choir's shadows against the plaster. The shadows sing different songs. Mrs. Dwyer, the laundress, spoke first. She kept a tin washtub in the courtyard where the fog off the East River gathered like a thin prayer. Her hands were hard as boards, scarred with old boils that never fully forgave heat. "I'll say this," she told anyone willing to listen. Their shirts folded in three. Everyone, the lines match. The collars lie as if they've been taught to breathe less. "Who taught them?" a girl asked. Mrs. Dwyer shrugged. "The house, I suppose. Some houses have a way of teaching." She began folding her own rags the same way, and only later did she realize she was humming under her breath, a hum she could not place, like a metronome in another room. On Sunday, Father Kavanagh praised the works from the pulpit. The church was dim as a pocket, incense patient in the rafters. "A bulwark," he said, "against the waywardness that ruins boys early and girls earlier." He paused there, as if a thought had snagged on a nail. The parish held its breath. The pause lengthened until it belonged to everyone. After Mass, in the sacristy, linen, laid like snowfall, wax blooming on brass, an altar boy asked, "Father, did you forget your words?" "No," said Kavanagh, very soft. "I remembered too many." In the tenement next door, Mrs. Moriarty pressed her ear to the wall on Thursdays. That was the day the voices braided numbers with beatitudes. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," the children recited, "for theirs is 2, 4, 6, the kingdom of heaven. 8, 10, blessed are they that mourn." "It sounds like arithmetic could save a soul," she told her sister. "Or replace it." "Which frightens you, war?" the sister asked. "The not knowing," she said, and opened her window to let the street's ordinary profanities chase away the silence. At the seamstress's bench, where hours bled through a single candle and needles kept their own small clock, Nora listened for resounding truths. "I heard nothing I could stitch to," she said. "Only the pulse of fear disguised as order." "How does fear sound?" the customer murmured. "Like waiting for a thing you cannot name to finish happening." Her thimble tapped the wood. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm was not hers. Were the children struck? A man at the pump swore he saw a bruise. "A pinched arm, at least," he said. A girl in the market, apples tucked into her apron, shook her head. "They don't raise hands, they adjust inches." "What does that mean?" She traced a line in the air beside her spine. "Like the way you set a clock when it's near right, only a minute off." A cat would not cross the O'Rourke threshold. It stopped, tail undecided, and sat like a small judge. A sparrow struck the parlor window and did not die, only fluttered, stunned, as if the glass had arrived before its own reflection. Small omens breed large arguments. There was a painting in the parlor, a Sacred Heart in cheap oils, halo cracked into a spider web. Someone had pinned a strip of paper to the frame. 1357. "What is it?" asked the carpenter when he returned to sand another stubborn jam. "Intervals," Maeve said, lighting a taper. "Of what?" She blew out the match and didn't answer. Smoke lifted like a thought that decides to live elsewhere. In the confessional, dark as a pocket universe, a voice spoke through the grate. It was older than a child's and younger than a parent's. "Is obedience a virtue if you can't tell who benefits?" "Confession is not catechism," Father Kavanagh answered. "Then what is it?" "A room where truth stands up and does not yet speak." The penitent wept without sound. The wood remembered every drop. A widow claimed she saw 2 children leave at dusk and return at dawn, as if their day had been misfiled. "They walked like pilgrims," she said. "Not in distance, in purpose." "What did they carry?" "Their own names, I think. Heavy as buckets." "What is truth?" Is it a ledger signed in a tidy hand, or the brief catch in a priest's breath? Can science circle a silence and tell you why your teeth hurt in it? Do some things exist because we wish them to, discipline, mercy, or do we wish them because they already rule us, like tides that never asked our permission? Laid side by side, the testimonies refused to cancel one another. They made a fabric that looked simple from across the room. Grey upon grey, a house like any other house, and only up close did the pattern reveal itself, tenderness crossing strictness, kindness threading control, over and over until repetition made the weave disappear to the eye and settle instead into the body. The choir kept practicing. The notes were still off, and yet standing in the doorway at dusk, you could almost believe the dissonance was the point, a yearning for harmony so fierce that even the wrong notes learned to hold still. The morning had that glassy winter hush when sound seems to crack if handled poorly. Frost webbed the railings. The East River wore a pale skin and breathed beneath it. From the O'Rourke door, a boy emerged alone as if he'd been gently set down by an invisible hand. His eyes were wide in the way of someone who has woken in a language not his own. Chalk marks brightened his wrists, white bars in sets of 5, then 5 again, then 3. Stevedore arithmetic, transplanted onto a child. He didn't say his name, he didn't say the houses. He looked up, lips moving quietly, counting the gulls as they stitched the sky to the water. A watchman, cap low, palms chapped by cold and routine, saw the boy settle on the stoop and did not move on. He knew how to measure distance, how to reckon a man by his stride and a night by its fights. Mercy, he had been told, is not really in the job description, it simply arrives like weather. Cold for standing, he said, not quite asking a question. He held out a tin cup of broth. Steam rose like advice that might be refused. The boy watched the steam, counted it. 1, 2, what are those for? The watchman nodded at the chalk. Telly. 7, the boy whispered, as if 7 explained everything. 7 what? The boy counted the steps down to the street, then back up without moving his feet. The watchman tried again. Chairs, beds, Hail Marys. He matched the boy's rhythm with his own finger upon the cup, tap, tap, tap. The beat came too easily, muscle memory from the barracks, from a sergeant who had taught him the comfort and terror of synchronization. From the doorway across the way, the widow O'Shea watched with her shawl clutched at her throat. The kindness, she murmured to no one. The way to carve the day into swallowable pieces. She had lived long enough to know that survival sometimes looks like ritual. Maeve arrived without hurry. Snowflakes clung to the black braid at her collar like small absolutions. She knelt so her face found the boy's eyes and did not demand they look back. He is not finished being made, she told the watchman. The words were gentle, but they carried a weight that made the air choose silence. He'll remember how to speak once we finish putting him together. And if he doesn't? The watchman said, surprising himself with the frankness of it. Then we begin again. Her smile was a fraction, something measured, something practiced, but not counterfeit. She stood, and the boy stood because she did. They moved toward the door in paired steps, the chalk bright as snow against skin. At the threshold the boy paused, counted the grain lines in the wood, and entered only when he reached a number that, whatever it was, met the rule. After they were gone, the watchman dipped a finger into the chalk dust on the stoop. It left a small star on his glove. He rubbed it off and could not quite get clean. That night he walked his circuit and counted lamps, windows, breaths, trying to attune himself to a reason he felt like a hair under the skin. Each number opened into an unentered room. Maybe it's misdeeds, said Seamus at the tavern, rolling the thought the way a stone is rolled between tongue and teeth. 5 for insolence, 5 for wasted bread, 3 for... or resistances, said Nora the seamstress, lantern light sewing gold into her irises. 5 for saying no to anger, 5 for swallowing a scream, 3 for enduring. The priest, polishing a chalice at the back table because even reverence must eat, lifted his eyes. Numbers can sanctify or they can conceal, he said. Sometimes they do both. The watchman laughed without mirth. Can counting make a boy whole? Can naming make a truth true? the priest countered. Or do we count because we're frightened of the parts of us that refuse to be tallied? That evening, in the church dark as a held breath, the watchman opened the parish registry, its calfskin swelling with damp. He meant to distract himself with the ordinary anchor of ink and names. He found a page where a child's entry had been scratched out and replaced with marks. 5, 5, 3. No letters. The page felt heavier beneath his fingertips, as if a small gravity had been concentrated there. He closed the book and heard, faintly, the metronome everyone pretended not to hear. He dreamed of pews numbered to the rafters, of a bell that rang 12 twice, then refused 13 out of principle. He woke with the feeling that some event had occurred inside his sleep and left no report behind. A stray dog, whip-thin and clever, came trotting down the block the next day. It paused at the O'Rourke threshold, sniffed, and sat. It scratched at its neck and whined in a pitch that made the watchman's gums hurt. He tossed it a scrap. It did not eat until he counted to 5. Days later, chalk faded into wrists into air. Snow fell and took the evidence with it, as snow gladly does. The boy was seen again, walking between taller children, mouth closed, eyes forward. On the back of his hand a new tally, 1. The number did not comfort the watchman. He started to wonder about 0. Whether a count could end. Whether the end of counting meant completion or erasure. Whether a soul is a ledger or a bell. Something measured into meaning, or something struck and ringing beyond measure. In the nights that followed, he kept counting to stay awake. 1 lamplight burning steady. 2 shadows crossing where no bodies walked. 3 taps from somewhere behind his teeth. Each number felt like a door held open just wide enough for him to glimpse the house within. Chairs aligned, breaths arranged, a child's hands learning the arithmetic of endurance, and then the door closed, very softly, with a courtesy that did not comfort him at all. The man from the bureau arrived in the brittle light of early March, 1840. His boots were polished, but the leather creaked in a way that betrayed their age. He carried a clipboard under one arm, the other hand resting on the brim of his hat, as though to keep his thoughts from escaping. Bureaucracy in those days traveled with a certain posture, upright, deliberate, and with a willingness to be fooled if the paperwork was in order. The O'Rourke stoop was swept clean, the brass bell still and mute. Petrick met him at the door with a nod that was neither welcome nor refusal. Inside, the air was warm but taut, as if it had been measured and rationed before his arrival. The inspector began in the dormitory. Bed frames stood in 2 perfect rows, aligned like soldiers at parade rest. Each blanket was edged in blue thread, corners tucked so sharply they could have drawn blood. He ran a finger along the wood. No dust. The children stood beside their beds, hands folded, eyes level. "Name," he said to the first. "Thomas," the boy replied, voice steady. The inspector moved down the line. Each name came without hesitation, each gaze held as if balancing a shallow bowl of water that must not spill. In the schoolroom, slate pencils stood in a cup, each sharpened to the same length. The blackboards were clean, save for a faint ghost of chalk, the residue of lessons erased but not forgotten. The kitchen smelled faintly of yeast. Loaves cooled in a neat sequence along the counter, their crusts cracking softly as they surrendered heat. The inspector noted the efficiency, no wasted movement, no idle hands. He ticked boxes on his form. No visible injuries, adequate bedding, sanitary conditions, orderly conduct. Patrick stood by the doorway, arms folded. Maeve moved between rooms with the quiet precision of someone who had already anticipated each question. "Discipline?" the inspector asked. "Firm," Patrick said, "consistent." The inspector nodded, as though the words were measurements he could record. What paper cannot measure is the small weight a silence puts on the lungs. The inspector felt it in the hallways, a hush that was not absence of sound, but the presence of something else. It pressed lightly against his ribs, like a hand reminding him to breathe in time with the house. He signed the paper, "Compliance." Patrick took it without looking, slid it into a drawer. That night the inspector dreamed of bell chimes. They came from no visible source, ringing in a pattern he could not place. 3, then 5, then 3 again. He woke with his jaw tight, as if he had been refusing to speak in his sleep. In the Bureau's official ledger he wrote, "No violations observed." In his private notebook he wrote, "Something orderly, beyond comfort." The difference between law and atmosphere, how do you audit it? The O'Rourkes filed the paper. The neighborhood filed the dream. Mrs. Finnegan, hearing of the inspection, remarked to the grocer, "Paper's a fine thing for counting chairs and loaves, but it can't count the way a child looks at a door before stepping through it." The grocer shrugged. "If the Lord's satisfied, what's left to measure?" She didn't answer. Some questions are better left hanging in the air, like the faint smell of yeast that lingers long after the bread is gone. Weeks later, the inspector passed the house on his way to another assignment. The shutters were closed. The stoop swept. He felt the same pressure in his chest. Subtle but insistent. He told himself it was the cold. But that night, the bells returned in his dreams. Louder this time. And when he woke, he found himself counting not sheep, but seconds between chimes, as though the house had taught him a rhythm he could not unlearn. He arrived on a pale afternoon in 1842, carrying a polished model of a human skull under one arm, its porcelain surface etched with neat black lines and tiny inscriptions. The gentleman's coat was of fine wool, his gloves kid-soft, his manner that of a man who believed the mind could be charted like a coastline. The children were assembled in the parlor, chairs drawn into a half-circle. The fire burned low, casting a copper sheen over the skull in his hands. He set it on the table as one might place a relic before the faithful. "This," he began, tapping the crown with a gloved finger, "is the map of your faculties. Here, firmness. Here, veneration. Here, secretiveness." His voice was patient, almost tender, as though naming virtues might coax them into being. One by one he called the children forward. The calipers gleamed in the firelight, their brass tips cool against skin. He traced the arcs of their skulls the way a fortune-teller reads a palm, pausing at each rise and hollow as if listening for a pulse beneath bone. Patrick stood in the doorway, arms folded, his gaze unreadable. Maeve moved silently along the wall, her eyes on the children, not the gentleman. "You see," the visitor said, "character is not a mystery. It is geography. The mind is a country and the skull its border." He found, to his satisfaction, a preponderance of order and conscientiousness. "A triumph," he declared, "of environment over innate misrule. Proof that discipline can shape the very architecture of the mind." The children held still with an ease that unsettled him. Their eyes did not flinch at the calipers, did not dart toward the door. Stillness, he thought, is a rare faculty, rarer still in the young. In his report he drew circles on a diagram of the head, each labeled with a number. The page looked like a clock face, as if the mind could be wound, set, and made to keep perfect time. But as he gathered his instruments, he noticed a boy at the far end of the room. The child's gaze was fixed on a crack in the plaster, a thin, jagged line that climbed toward the ceiling. His lips moved faintly as though the crack were speaking to him in a language only he understood. The gentleman paused. "What do you see there, lad?" The boy did not look away. "A road," he said softly. "One you can't walk twice." The gentleman said nothing. He packed the calipers, lifted the skull and left the house, with the faint sense that he had been measuring the wrong thing. That night, in his private notebook, he wrote a line he would never publish. "They hold their stillness like men hold their breath under water. It is not granted. It is performed. Science," he reflected, "loves a halo, something clean, symmetrical and whole. Belief, on the other hand, loves a thorn, something that pierces, but resists the hand that would tame it." The O'Rourke house offered both, but never at the same time. If discipline could be proven by bumps and ridges, then mercy, he suspected, had to be sought elsewhere. Perhaps in the way a child's eyes follow a crack in the wall. Perhaps in the silence between questions. Weeks later, his official report was filed in the Bureau's archives. Exemplary order. Evidence of cultivated faculties. No signs of degeneracy. But the private note remained in his desk drawer, folded between pages of an atlas. Sometimes, when the city's noise pressed too close, he would take it out and read it again, tracing the words with his fingertip as though they were another kind of map. One that charted not the shape of the skull, but the unmeasurable terrain beneath. And always in the back of his mind, the boy's voice lingered. A road you can't walk twice. They said it softly, as if the very shape of the word might bruise the air. Penance. Not punishment. Not cruelty. A way to walk a crooked line straight again. The whisper moved among the women first, at the pump, under shawls at dusk, in pew shadows where candles breathed in little gold intervals. If the city distrusted devotions that counted, the women counted anyway. Some said the O'Rourkes brought a rule from older continents, folded small and carried like a relic under the tongue. Bare feet in winter. A bowl of cold water by the door. The day divided into beads. Inside the house, morning began in blue light with a quiet that felt rehearsed. A basin glazed like ice waited on a small table. Beside it, a cloth with its edges hemmed in blue thread. A wooden kneeler left a faint groove in the floorboards, the kind of track only repetition can carve. Outside, the river paced itself against stone. Inside, breath obeyed a gentler metronome. "They do not strike," said Mrs. Keene, snapping beans over a chipped bowl. "They sequence." Her fingers moved in tens. She did not notice. "Sequence? What?" asked her sister. "Acts," Mrs. Keene said. "As if the soul were a day you could arrange." A former postulant, the kind of woman who wore quiet like a second veil, had married and moved 2 doors down. She watched from her window with a caution that never fully left her bones. "Penance is a kind of intimacy," she told her husband one night, both of them warmed by cheap whiskey and the fire's patient breath. "Someone holds you to an image of yourself that may or may not be yours, and if it is not yours," he asked, "then it becomes you by repetition," she said, and did not say whether that was salvation or theft. Rumors collected like mist over the docks. A neighbor saw a child step onto the stoop at dawn, lift his feet from the cold stone, and stand there on arches for the count of 10. Another swore the children walked the square of the parlor in a silent procession, stopping at corners, as if each were a station of the cross transposed to a domestic geometry. On Wednesdays, a woman carrying bread slowed and heard it. Soft voice, softer response. Confiteor, multiplication. Hail Mary, math and mercy knotted into a single rope. In church, Father Kavanagh preached order and the dignity of a well-kept will. Men nodded. Businessmen, dock foremen. Men who trusted lines more than letters. In kitchens, women weighed the weight of quiet correction against the softer cruelties of neglect, the way a thumb weighs flour before agreeing to call it enough. "Bare feet?" the grocer asked, skeptical, tallying onions. "A winter minute," said Nora the seamstress, threading her needle by the window where the light was honest. "Just long enough to remember the floor remembers you." Remembering her. Sometimes remembering is the only proof you are still yourself. On the parlor wall, the Sacred Heart painting still cracked like a web, but someone had looped a small chaplet over the frame, 5 beads, a gap, 5 more. The paper strip with 1357 was gone. In its place, the faintest chalk arc, a crescent in the lower corner, as if a cycle had been traced and then refused to be complete. "Do they wear a habit when no one sees?" Mrs. Finnegan asked the former postulant at market. "Vows can be held in the mouth," she said. "Secret vows?" "No," she answered, eyes briefly lighting with a memory that was not entirely kind. "Exact one." A pigeon wandered into the nave during Mass, unhurried, unashamed, stepping bead to bead along the aisle as if counting without knowing it. When the Agnus Dei began, the church clock stuck and would not move, arms halted between mercy and time. Later, the sacristan found the brass hands warm. At the Navy Yard, a doctor with ink on his cuffs argued that routine cures chaos. "You bring temperature down by degrees, not by pleading," he told a watchman, who listened with the patience of a man who has learned when not to contradict. "And for the soul?" the watchman asked. The doctor smiled the way a man does when he knows he's out of his depth and refuses to drown. "The soul is not my ship," he said. But if it were, I'd set it to a schedule. Night carried its own proofs. A child's dream leaked into the hallway, a rosary the size of a room, each bead a chore, each decade an hour, and somewhere a missing bead that the fingers couldn't find. The child woke with the taste of iron and counted her teeth to make sure none had been bargained away. What is truth? Is it the balance struck between act and intention, between a bowl of cold water and the hand that offers it? Can science ever explain the soul's obedience to a count, or the way repetition can feel like a bridge and a wall at once? Do some things exist only because we believe in them, penance, progress, or do we believe in them because they already exist? Like tides, like bells, like the winter that returns whether we deserve it or not. The O'Rourke house moved through its days like a rosary pulled through the fist of time. One act, then another, until meaning of a sort appeared by accumulation. Men nodded in pews. Women did the math in kitchens. Flour dust, rising like candle smoke. The shape of the soul, like the shape of a bed, must be made each morning. Whether the soul agreed was another matter, and souls, even tidy ones, are not required to testify. It began with chalk dust. Fine, white and clinging to the cuffs of the children's sleeves like the residue of some quiet weather. At first, the shapes on their slates seemed harmless. Circles, lines, small arrows. But one afternoon, a dockhand, delivering coal, paused to watch a boy finish his work. It was a compass rose. Not the kind that points to the four winds, but one divided into sevenths and ninths. Its arrows not aimed at north, south, east, or west, but inward toward a center that seemed to retreat the longer you looked at it. Other slates revealed number wheels, chalk circles bisected and quartered, then fractured into stranger proportions. Some bore sequences that skipped like stones over water, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, prime numbers stepping away from the ordinary march. By the week's end, a rumor had taken root. The O'Rourke house was steered by numbers. Certain phrases, it was said, were repeated in increments: 3 times for correction, 5 for praise, 7 for something no one could name. Steps were counted in sequences that never landed on even tens. Corrections were tallied until they formed a pattern invisible to the eye, but felt in the body, the way sailors feel a current in the dark without seeing the tide. When asked, Patrick O'Rourke smiled with a tired charity. The kind that looks like secrecy if you're hungry for a scene to pull. "We count what we care for," he said. To Mrs. Keene, whose daughter had learned to sleep without crying, that sounded like love. To Mr. Doyle, whose brother had learned never to raise his eyes, it sounded like a leash. Numbers are innocent until they are not. One evening, Nora the seamstress found a scrap of slate left on the stoop. On it a compass rose had been drawn, but the cardinal points were replaced with letters V, S, P, O. She traced them with her thumb, wondering if they were initials or instructions or both. When she looked again, the chalk had smudged into something unreadable, as if the slate had decided she wasn't meant to know. In the tavern, the dockhand described the feeling of standing in that schoolroom. "It's like being in a ship's hold when the tide turns," he said. "You can't see it, but your bones know." A man at the next table leaned in. "And if the tide's going the wrong way?" The dockhand shrugged. "Then you hope the captain knows the map." But what if the map wasn't of the world at all? What if it was of the self? And what happens when the self refuses to be charted? One boy, asked to explain his drawing, said simply, "It's where you go when you've done everything right." "And where is that?" He tapped the center of the rose. "Here." The center was empty. Maeve, when pressed, offered no diagrams, no explanations. She only said, "A straight path is not always the shortest." In the church, Father Kavanagh found a folded paper in the poor box. On it, a wheel of numbers spiraled inward, ending in a single word: stay. He kept it in his missal, though he could not say why. Weeks later, the dockhand returned with another delivery. He glanced into the schoolroom and saw the children walking in a slow circle, each step landing on a chalk mark. At the 12th mark, they paused, turned inward, and began again. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint scuff of soles and the occasional tap of chalk against slate. The dockhand left quickly, But that night, lying in his narrow bed, he found himself counting his breaths in prime numbers. It felt safer, though he could not have said from. The compass rose, in its truest form, is meant to guide you outward, to seas, to lands, to horizons. But here, in the O'Rourke house, it pointed inward, as if the journey worth taking was not across water or land, but into the architecture of one's own obedience. And perhaps that was the most unsettling thing of all. The suspicion that the voyage had already begun, and that the map was being drawn on you line by line without your consent. The year was 1847, and the camera arrived like a visiting physician, its operator carrying a chemical case strapped in leather, the glass vials clinking softly as he walked. The case smelled faintly of ether and lavender soap, the scent of a man who handled both poison and cure. The device itself was a polished wooden box with a brass lens that caught the winter light and held it like a secret. The O'Rourkes received him in the parlor. Patrick stood with his hands behind his back, Maeve with her palm resting lightly on the shoulder of the tallest child. The children were arranged by height, their hands folded, their shoes aligned to the edge of the carpet. The air was warm from the fire, but still so still that the operator felt as though he had stepped into a painting. "Exposure demands stillness," he said, adjusting the tripod. The house obliged. He removed the lens cap, counting under his breath. The children's eyes fixed on a point just above his head, as if bracing against something unseen. In the corner, a small pendulum clock ticked with the patience of a creature that knew it would outlive them all. When the plate was developed, the faces were there, present, but not graspable. The eyes held a softness that was not blur but something else, a readiness, or perhaps a resignation. The pendulum clock in the background had smeared into a grey, vowel-shaped shadow, as though time itself had been caught mid-utterance. The operator frowned. "Early light," he muttered. Then, "My hands." Then a draft. But none of these satisfied him. He wrapped the plate in soft cloth, as if it could bruise, and carried it away. That night he showed it to friends in the back room of a coffee house. They leaned in, their breath fogging the glass. "It hums," he said. They laughed, but he insisted. "Like a struck glass you cannot hear, but your teeth remember the sound." The daguerreotype passed from hand to hand. Against the dark of the room the image deepened, the children's faces seeming to lean forward, their gazes converging on something just outside the frame. Pictures promise proof, but they also supply ghosts. In the weeks that followed, the plate returned to the O'Rourke house, where it was placed in a small wooden frame and set on the mantel. Neighbors came to see it, each leaving with a different impression. Mrs. Finnegan said the children looked as though they were listening for a bell. The dockhand swore they were waiting for a command. The seamstress thought they had already begun whatever it was and were waiting to be forgiven for it. No one could agree, but no one could look away. One evening Father Kavanagh visited. He stood before the image for a long time, his fingers resting lightly on the back of a chair. "They are not posing," he said at last. "They are enduring." Maeve, standing beside him, did not answer. The operator, for his part, could not forget the hum. He began to notice it elsewhere, in the pause before a church bell, in the moment between a question and its answer, in the stillness of a room just after someone leaves. It was not a sound, but a pressure, a reminder that something had been set in motion and was waiting for its appointed hour. Months later, the daguerreotype was shown again, this time in the window of a small shop that sold spectacles and pocket watches. Passers-by stopped to look. Some tilted their heads as if trying to catch the angle at which the children might return their gaze. Others moved on quickly, unsettled, without knowing why. The image remained there for a week before disappearing. No one saw it leave. In the absence of the plate, the memory of it grew sharper. People spoke of the way the children's eyes seemed to measure you, the way the blurred clock suggested that time in that house did not move as it did elsewhere. And somewhere, in a drawer lined with cloth, the plate lay wrapped and waiting, its hum intact, its faces patient, its silence holding the shape of a bell that had not yet rung. The letter was written in a hand that pressed harder than it needed to, as though the pen were a small chisel and the paper a slab of stone. It was addressed to the alderman, but the salutation wavered between grievance and confession. The noise, she wrote, is not loud. It is worse. She described it as the absence after a strike, the moment when the air still remembers the blow but refuses to speak of it. At dawn, she said, the silence was furnished. Footsteps measured to the grain of the floorboards, a correction soft as feathers, striking a rug, then a pause that settled on her chest, like a cat unwilling to move. She asked whether quiet could be regulated, whether the law knew the difference between peace and a held tongue. The alderman's reply was a form letter, polite and hollow. The city knew what to do with barking dogs, with barrels tipping in the street, with the metallic quarrel of a drunk against a lamppost. But the physics of restraint, the way silence could be used as a tool, was beyond its ordinances. She thought of moving. She even packed a crate once, folding her linens into the same thirds she had seen the O'Rourke children use. But the rent was fair, and habit is a chain too light to feel until you try to walk away. So she stayed. From her window she watched the children become adolescents. Their obedience thickened, congealing into a way of walking that made her hands sweat. They moved as though the ground beneath them had been measured and approved, each step a signature on an invisible contract. In summer she saw them in the yard, standing in pairs, speaking without moving their mouths. In winter she saw them through the frost-blurred glass, their heads bent over slates, the chalk marks erased before they could be read. She began to dream of corridors, long, narrow, lined with closed doors. Behind each a sound she could almost name, the scrape of a chair, the click of a latch, the faint exhale of someone deciding not to speak. She would wake with her jaw aching as if she had been holding it shut all night. One evening she met Maeve on the stoop. The air smelled faintly of soap and coal. "Your children are very quiet," she said. Maeve smiled, the kind of smile that closes a subject rather than opens it. "Quiet is a form of respect," for whom the neighbor asked. Maeve's eyes flicked toward the door. "For what keeps us?" The neighbor did not ask again. She began sleeping with her window open, even in the cold, hoping the street noise might reteach her how to breathe. The clatter of wagon wheels, the shouts of fishmongers, the occasional curse from a passing sailor, these were the sounds that reminded her lungs they were not under oath. But the O'Rourke silence seeped in anyway, like a draft that knows the seams of a house. One night she heard the bell. Not loud, not urgent, just a single chime, followed by the sound of feet aligning themselves to it. She lay still, counting the seconds until the next sound. None came. In the morning she considered writing another letter. But what would she say? That the quiet next door had begun to shape her own? That she found herself pausing mid-task, waiting for a signal she could not name? That she feared the difference between refuge and captivity might be nothing more than the story you choose to tell yourself? She did not have the word for it, so she called it discipline. And when she passed the O'Rourke house on her way to market, she found herself walking in time with the children's steps, her own feet falling into their measured rhythm before she could stop them. The summer of 1854 carried with it a grammar the city had not spoken in years. Blue rags knotted to door handles, bowls of vinegar stationed on windowsills like sentries who never slept. The river, sluggish in the heat, was addressed in murmured prayers as if its tide might carry sickness away if only it were asked politely enough. When the first cases appeared near the Navy Yard, the O'Rourke door, so long a sealed mouth, unlatched. The sound was small, but it carried. By nightfall, cots had been set up in the parlor and along the hallway, each one draped in linen that smelled faintly of lye and sun. They stood like confessors, ready to receive whatever the fever would force from the body. The children moved through the rooms with the precision of trained hands, water drawn from the pump, cloths wrung and folded, foreheads cooled, breaths counted in and out, as if the rhythm itself might coax the sick back toward the shore of the living. Those who had suspected hardness in the O'Rourkes now saw utility. The same routine that had once seemed a cage became, in this season, the scaffold for mercy. The ledger brought back into the light no longer tallied deviations or degrees of voice lowered. Instead, it recorded compressors applied, minutes between sips, hours of unbroken rest. Patrick's jaw, once set like a lock, unhinged into visible weariness. Maeve's hands, capable, fierce, were gentler than rumor had allowed. She moved from cot to cot, her palm lingering on a temple, her voice low and steady, as if speaking to the fever itself. "Breathe with me," she told a boy whose skin burned under her touch. "Count," he whispered. "Count," she said, and together they did. 1, 2, 3, until his eyes closed. The dockhand, Seamus, who had once muttered about leashes and obedience, found himself lying on one of those cots, a cool cloth on his brow. He watched the children work, their movements seamless, their silences purposeful. Gratitude settled in his chest, like a stone dropped into deep water. Outside, the city's bells tolled for the dead. Inside, the only chime was the soft clink of a ladle against a cup. Witness is not absolution, it is only another page. The fever did not erase the questions that had long shadowed the O'Rourke house. It only postponed them. When the worst had passed, the cots were folded and carried away. The ledger closed, the door latched again with its familiar soft click, a sound that to some meant safety and to others meant the return of something less merciful. The old questions returned at their old volume. Does a routine that can save a life also have the right to shape it? Is the hand that cools your brow the same hand that teaches you how to bow your head? Seamus, recovered and back at the docks, turned his hat in his hands when asked about his time inside. "They saved me," he said simply. And gratitude," he added after a pause, "is its own kind of silence." He wore that silence for years. In the evenings, when the river caught the last light and the gulls wheeled low, he would sometimes glance toward the O'Rourke house. The shutters would be closed, the stoop swept, the bell still, and he would remember the cool cloth, the steady voice, the counting. He never decided whether the memory was comfort or caution. Perhaps it was both, and somewhere inside, the ledger waited, its pages ready for whatever the next season would demand. Whether it be mercy, correction, or something that blurred the line between the two. It was late autumn when the letter appeared, folded once, sealed without wax, left on the counter of Mr. Hanrahan's print shop. The boy who delivered it was older than the O'Rourke children most remembered, but not yet a man. His shoulders carried the memory of a uniform he had never worn, his eyes the habit of looking past people rather than at them. He did not give his name, he did not wait for questions. Hanrahan turned the paper over in his hands. The handwriting was deliberate, the ink still damp enough to smudge if touched without care. It began without greeting, without preamble, only verbs, lined like commands. Stand, align, repeat, reduce. The boy wrote of a correction delivered in inches, not blows, of a room so still that birds avoided the windows, veering away mid-flight as if warned by something they could not see. He described a bell whose sound arrived before its swing, as though time itself had been trained to anticipate. He called the O'Rourkes both parents and instruments, shaping and measuring in the same motion. They held us to a shape they believed we could be. We learned to hold ourselves to it. If they were loved, he wrote, it was by an ideal that never slept. The letter spoke of counting as a kind of freedom, walking 7 steps, turning, walking 7 more. Because then the mind was not a battlefield but a ruler. Each thought measured, each fear given a number small enough to hold. There was no accusation in the words, but no absolution either. The sentences stood like fence posts, evenly spaced, marking a boundary without declaring what lay inside it. Hanrahan read it twice before setting the type. The press groaned as it always did, the ink rolling onto the letters with the smell of iron and oil. When the page emerged, he held it in his hands until the ink dried, as if waiting for the words to decide whether they meant to stay. He published it without an author. By the week's end, the letter had passed through the neighborhood like a shared dream. People read it and found themselves in its line. Mrs. Keene, whose daughter now slept through the night, saw in it the mercy of structure. Mr. Doyle, whose brother no longer met anyone's eyes, saw in it the quiet cruelty of erasure. At the tavern, Seamus traced the printed words with a calloused finger. We make rules to survive ourselves, he said, and then we forget which came first, the rule or the need. Nora the seamstress read it by candlelight, the flame trembling in the draught. Survival isn't always virtue, she murmured, but it can look the same in the dark. Even Father Kavanagh kept a copy folded into his missal. He would take it out between confessions, running his thumb along the crease as though smoothing a wrinkle in the soul. The letter did not name the house, but it didn't need to. The verbs were enough. The rhythm was enough. Anyone who had heard the O'Rourke bell, or seen the children's measured steps, could hear the echo in the words. Some claimed the boy had left the city. Others swore they saw him weeks later walking the docks, counting his paces in sevens. Handrahan kept the original in a drawer beneath the counter. Sometimes when the shop was empty, he would unfold it and read the last line again. We take a measuring tape to the heart's unmeasurable rooms. He never decided whether it was a lament or a prayer, and perhaps that was the letter's truest power, that it left the reader holding both possibilities at once, the way the O'Rourke children had been taught to hold their breath, not knowing whether the next sound would be a command, a blessing, or the quiet click of a door closing behind them. By the spring of 1861, the city's attention had been claimed by the war. The streets thinned of young men, their absence leaving a strange echo in the markets and along the docks. Flags hung from windows, their colors already dulled by soot. The O'Rourke house seemed to dim in sympathy, as if the air inside had learned to kneel. The bell rope, once taut and ready, frayed to a pale twist and was not mended. The sound it had carried, sharp, precise, unyielding, was replaced by a silence that felt less like peace and more like a room holding its breath. The children were fewer now, and older. They left in ordinary ways, a pair of boots missing from the line, a bed smoothed flat and left behind, a slate leaning against the wall with its last lesson half erased. No farewells were seen, only the quiet subtraction of presents. The ledger's entries thinned like an old man's hair, days skipped, lines shorter, the ink paler. What had once been a dense record of increments and corrections became a sparse scattering of notes, as if the discipline itself had grown tired. Then, one morning, the door did not open. The neighborhood felt it before they saw it. A strange sensation, relief braided with an ache like phantom sound. The absence of the morning routine was not silence, but a hollow where something had been. Father Kavanagh said a mass without names. His voice carried through the nave like a tide that had forgotten its shore. The alderman, upon hearing the news, moved the O'Rourke file to another stack without comment. The neighbor who had learned to sleep with her window open closed it that night, then opened it again before dawn. She could not decide which air she preferred, the street's restless noise or the house's disciplined quiet. Speculation filled the gaps. Some said the O'Rourkes had returned across the water back to the stony hills and grey lakes of their ancestors. Others claimed they had entered a quieter vocation, perhaps a cloister where their rules would be welcome, and others said nothing at all, which is another way of saying they preferred their beliefs unspoiled by facts. Houses forget slowly. The brass bell dulled, its surface losing the small gleam it had once held even in shadow. The chalk jar on the windowsill emptied and was not refilled. The grooves in the floorboards, worn by years of measured steps, remained like the ghost of a path no one walked anymore. When a new family moved in, they painted the shutters a cheerful green. The color never took. Within months it began to peel, curling back to reveal the original restraint beneath a muted, disciplined hue that seemed to reject ornament. Children from the new household played in the yard, their laughter spilling into the street, but those who had lived through the O'Rourke years noticed something odd. The games never lasted long near the stoop. Dolls rolled to the door were retrieved quickly, without lingering. One evening the widow O'Shea passed by and thought she heard the faintest chime from within. Not the bright ring of a new bell, but the memory of the old one, thin, precise, and final. She did not stop walking. In time, the house became just another address, its history folded into the city's larger forgetfulness. But for those who had once matched their steps to its rhythm, the absence was not complete. It lived in the way they paused before speaking, in the way they counted without meaning to, in the way they sometimes woke at dawn expecting to hear a door open and felt the weight of its refusal instead. The O'Rourke house had closed itself, and in doing so, it had left a shape in the air, an outline that no new tenant, no fresh paint, no passing year could quite erase. By the time he returned, the city had shed its old skin. The cobbles were patched with brick, the shop fronts brighter, their painted signs shouting in colors that would have felt indecent in the 80s. The gulls were fewer, their cries replaced by the clatter of carts and the hiss of steam from the new ironworks. He did not look up at the house. Instead, he counted steps, breaths, keeping time with a memory that had long ago decided not to call itself by name. The numbers came without effort, as natural as the beat of his heart. 7 paces to the corner, 11 to the lamppost, 3 breaths between each. The O'Rourke house stood where it always had, but it had learned the art of disguise. A seam along the foundation betrayed a repair, a faint scar on the brick marked where a lantern had once hung. The shutters were painted a color that tried for cheer, but landed somewhere nearer to surrender. People still told the story, but only in passing, the way you touch a tooth that aches only when you insist on feeling it. The details shifted with the teller. Some spoke of kindness, others of severity, but the shape of the tale remained. Was it cruelty with clean hands, or a courage that refused to fear the cost of order? Perhaps the more honest question was smaller, harder. Why do we hunger to be arranged? And what happens to the parts of us that resist arrangement? He paused at the corner, letting the crowd flow around him. The air smelled of coal smoke and bread, ordinary smells that once would have been foreign to this street. The house behind him was just another building, its windows reflecting nothing but the day's light. Truth, like discipline, can become an idol if it forgets its subject. The O'Rourke's house had trained breath, gaze, and step. For a time the city itself had breathed with it, its mornings measured by the opening of that door, its afternoons marked by the quiet procession of children returning to the world outside. Now the bell no longer rang. The air was ordinary, and yet, if you stood very still in the right place at the right hour, you could feel it, a slow metronome somewhere inside you, beginning without your consent, a rhythm you had not invited but recognized all the same. It was the same rhythm that had once aligned the steps of children in the yard, that had timed the cooling of loaves in the kitchen, that had measured the pause between a question and its answer. He felt it now, in the bones of his feet, in the hinge of his jaw. One part of him had been waiting all along for permission to hold still. Another part had been waiting just as long to bolt. He did neither. Instead, he walked on, counting without meaning to, the numbers falling into place, like beads on a string. Behind him, the house kept its silence. Ahead of him, the city moved in its own newer rhythm. But somewhere between the two, between the past that had shaped him and the present that no longer required his obedience, he carried the measure of that other time, and it carried him.